Welcome to our introduction to Hume. From rationalism to empiricism. There are four key elements I wish to discuss. First, I want to go over a basic philosophical distinction between a priori and a posteriori claims. Then I want to talk a little bit about Descartes' rationalism and how thoroughgoing it was. We'll then discuss Newton and the turn to empiricism, and finally, we'll look at an overview of Hume's project to prepare you to read section 1 of Hume's Enquiry and beyond. First, we say that a claim is a priori if its truth can be justified by the mind alone. No experience is required to establish that the claim is true. Most philosophers believe that statements in mathematics are a priori. You take, for example, Pythagoras' theorem. We could say that the statement is a priori because we justify its truth by creating a mathematical proof, which is something we can do with our intellect alone. The contrast to that is a posteriori claims. Now we say that a claim is a posteriori if it is not a priori. That is, if its truth can be only established by appealing to experience, by which philosophers typically mean experiments or observations. And we deliberately set up these two categories or types of claims so that the categories are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So any given statement that makes some assertion should be either an a posteriori claim or an a priori claim, never neither, never both. Most philosophers would agree that an ordinary claim about our everyday experience, such as it is raining outside, would count as a good example of an a posteriori claim. I cannot verify or confirm that claim simply by thinking about things. I have to go out and look. Of course, philosophers will disagree in some important cases. Most notably, Descartes will say that the statement God exists is a priori, whereas Hume will say that any statement that asserts the existence of something is always an a posteriori claim. We say that Descartes is a rationalist, or the type of philosophy that he believes in is called rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophical view that some general truths about the world can be justified by reason alone. In other words, some general truths about the world are a priori. The key phrase here is that these are supposed to be truths about the world. So, for example, for Descartes, the statement God exists, which is about the world broadly speaking, about what there is in the cosmos, is an a priori statement. Likewise, the statement that corporeal objects exist, according to Descartes, is an a priori statement. We can arrive at it from other a priori statements, such as the causal principle and the source of ideas principle in Meditation 3. So for Descartes, these statements are about the world, and we know them just using our intellect. So they are a priori, and that's what singles him out as a rationalist philosopher. Now, Descartes' rationalism is very, very deep. He proposed, for example, an a priori metaphysical foundation of science. And we see this most clearly in his Principles of Philosophy, which we did not read, but we can get a hint of it in Meditations, especially in Meditation 6, after Descartes proves that corporeal objects actually exist. He goes on to say that what he knows for certain is that my ideas of corporeal objects resemble genuine physical things in their mathematical respects. So, for example, if I perceive a rectangular table, that's because the table really is rectangular. That is not true for other things, for example, the color of the table. Just because I perceive a table that is red, it does not follow from that I can be certain that there is redness in the world. But I can be certain that my ideas of corporeal objects resemble the corporeal objects themselves in their mathematical regards. And that means that whatever I prove a priori in mathematics applies to the physical world. So for instance, if I prove that right-angled triangles satisfy Pythagoras' theorem, then if I have an image of a right-angled triangle because I'm witnessing a triangular thing in the physical world, that triangular thing will have its sides satisfy the Pythagorean theorem. So this is a very interesting aspect of Descartes' philosophy because the certainty of our mathematical knowledge itself is based on my knowledge of the existence of God. And that's based on knowing other general metaphysical principles. And in that sense, all of that machinery, the metaphysical principles like the causal principle, metaphysical claims like God exists, all of that machinery underwrites the certainty of mathematics and its applicability to the world. And so Descartes, in this sense, develops a metaphysical foundation for a mathematical description of the physical world. And he did indeed attempt to develop such a system of physics that began with 3 laws of motion, which he took to be a priori laws of motion. What I mean when I say that the laws of physics, according to Descartes, were a priori, is that if you ask him what grounds or reasons do we have for believing that these laws are true, his answer might be something that appeals maybe to the existence of God. So for instance, suppose we look at Descartes' 3rd law of motion, which is a conservation law that says that motion is conserved in all interactions. And suppose we ask Descartes, well, why do you think that law is true? What evidence do we have for believing the truth of that law? He might say something like, well, because God exists and God created the world, and you can't ever get something from nothing, so therefore you can't ever get more motion from less motion. And all of those reasons that he gives for justifying a physical law of nature that is a conservation of law of motion are all supposed to be a priori statements in his philosophy. Statements that we can know simply by meditating, simply by focusing our intellect on discovering the truth and avoiding error. Descartes also proposed a vortex theory of the solar system, which held that the sun is indeed at the center of the universe and it spins around, but there's a fluid that fills all of space. Now, it's a very subtle fluid. We can't see it, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, but it's there. And this fluid is spun around by the sun, and the planets sort of float in this fluid and get carried along by it. And along with a very unique definition of motion, this enables Descartes to say that in one sense the earth moves, but in another sense it doesn't. And this way he tries to avoid basically getting into trouble with the Catholic Church the way Galileo had done. But then Newton comes along. Remember, Newton comes in history after Descartes. Descartes publishes his Principles of Philosophy with a system of physics in the middle of the 17th century, and Newton's work is published in the mid-1680s. Newton explicitly criticized the system of Cartesian physics, sometimes in published works and also in other places that have only recently been discovered. Newton criticized Cartesian physics in its details and also more broadly at its conceptual core. For instance, in Book 2 of Principia, Newton argues against the vortex theory of the solar system by developing basically a system of fluid dynamics that says that as a result of the system of fluid dynamics, which is based on his 3 laws of motion, it cannot be the case that the planets move around the sun in the way that Descartes hypothesized. There are other places where Newton explicitly criticizes Descartes or the Cartesians. And also in one recently discovered manuscript, Newton argues against Descartes' definition of motion. So for us, philosophically, as we take a step back and think about what Newton did, we could say that Newton implicitly showed that a priori knowledge was far more restricted than Descartes thought. Descartes thought we could know all sorts of things, general things, about the universe just by thinking. Descartes was no fool. He didn't think that you could know the boiling point of water just by thinking about it. That would be ridiculous. He thought you have to do good empirical science. But Descartes did believe that you might be able to know, for example, the 3 basic laws of motion just by thinking about it. And it's as if Newton said, well, if you try to do it that way, then you simply get a system of physics that does not work. What the intellect can know in and of itself is far more restricted than what Descartes thought. So this inspired philosophers to ask, well, look, if this is what's going on in natural philosophy, as it was then called, maybe there's a more general point that we can glean from this, that in general, philosophers such as Descartes, who thought we could know all sorts of things a priori, were simply too ambitious. Maybe there are limits to what we can know by merely using our intellect. And what we need to do in philosophy is figure out what those limits are. So on the British Isles, this sort of philosophical way of looking at things gave rise to a view that we now call empiricism. And empiricism is the philosophical view that truths about the world can only be justified by experience. The empiricists were very influenced by Newton, either because they thought that he had it all right or because they agreed with some of it but not all of it. But they all basically started exploring this question of, is there a limit to what we can know? Because empiricists believe that truths about the world can only be justified by experience. So in other words, all truths about the world are a posteriori. Hume, specifically, believed that Descartes' claims about a priori knowledge were greatly exaggerated. And so Hume, in An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, sets out to develop what he himself calls a science of human nature. Because you see, for Hume, if we're going to figure out whether there's a limit to what we can know, we have to understand the instrument that we use for gaining knowledge, and that instrument is our mind. Now, for Hume, it is also correct to say that the best understanding of the mind is what we obtain when we approach the mind scientifically. So Hume wants to develop a science, like a Newtonian science of the mind, that will determine how the mind works. Because the goal is exactly to find the limits of knowledge by examining the workings and operations of the mind. Because if we understand how the mind works, we might be able to say, well, look, given that this is how the mind works, we can't ever know with certainty blank. And what goes in the blank might be something like God exists, or maybe something like the soul is immortal, or some other metaphysical claim that prior philosophers, especially Descartes, thought they could know with absolute certainty. So you see, we again return to our Socratic theme. There's a sense in which Hume's empiricism has a deep Socratic motivation, because Hume believes that Descartes is pretending to have knowledge about things that he cannot possibly know. Because Hume believes that Descartes is pretending to have knowledge where he cannot possibly have knowledge given how the mind works. So as you go off to read section 1 of Hume's Enquiry, see if you can find some statements in there that refer to Newton, either implicitly or explicitly. And see if you can find a few quotations that really capture, first, Hume's suspicion about metaphysics of the sort that Descartes was interested in, and second, Hume's description of his project as a science that sets out to understand the human mind with a view toward understanding the limits of knowledge.